So let's get to it.
Okay.
Alright, so Dave, before we start, we want to hear a drunk story from you.
If any.
No real drunk stories, to be honest.
Do you have all your friends? Definitely, you have one or two drunken friends that is like, wow, causing trouble all the time.
Thankfully, I have friends who generally don't get too drunk. So it's been,
That's your
that's good.
about it.
I guess the closest is that I tried some vodka in Poland, and I think I drank a little bit too much. But it was in the hotel bar, so I could just get back to my room quite quickly.
So it was a really smooth vodka, I would say, that made you drink a lot.
I didn't know. I just tried 4 different small shots.
Okay.
Different
I mean, they're quite well known for their
Yeah.
vodka. Yes.
Sure, be Russian ones.
Okay, so thank you for coming onto our show. I personally listened to a couple of your episodes and I thought, as well as saw what you usually share on TikTok, even though you didn't post in a while, but I found that those videos are super interesting, and yeah, I was talking to Ivan about it also, I think people are really interested in it because it racked up so many views and stuff like that, and the pictures that you regularly share on Twitter as well, if I'm not wrong, which made you a Twitter influencer of sorts, I would say. Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about history. Where did this interest start for you?
Well, I guess it started because in my previous job I was helping to co-organize the activities related to the Singapore Bicentennial.
Okay.
And in the preparation of all those activities, I kind of realized that a lot of people have an interest in Singapore history, local history, and all that, but they firstly do not know where to look for the sources. And secondly, I think many of them had a bad experience with social studies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a subject they grow to hate, but it's also a subject that covers many of the basics of Singapore history. So because the subject itself is hated, then people do not really want to avoid the subject.
You have that association since young of like just because you have to choose between that and geography. And
Not bad, I still remember.
Barely. And then I think most people are like, they just hate these two classes the most.
It's all memory work. Right?
Yeah.
You have to memorize the dates and like when this happened, when that happened.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
I think it just sucks all the fun away from learning. Like you're forced to learn it, you're forced to memorize all these kind of things, and it just when you actually want to learn about it, you're just like, oh shit, I used to do this in school or something. I was supposed to do this.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not for me.
That's why once in a while when I come across someone like you, I think it's very amazing to hear people like just share passionately about history.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right that people have this perception that history is a memorization of dates, places, events, because that's how it's usually taught.
Yeah.
Like, you need to remember this sequence of events, and these were the important personalities.
Correct.
And that these dates were very pivotal to Singapore, 1942, 1963, 1965, things like that. So we've grown to associate history as such, and then we forget about the stories that are history. And history is all about stories.
Yeah.
And these stories are the way that we can both study the past and at least perhaps learn some lessons for the future. Although often we fail to learn those lessons.
Exactly. Actually, if teachers at that point of time just phrase it in a way like history is actually just learning about stories, learning about the past people's mistakes. Instead of, oh, this thing happened on the date, and then what happened on that date, you gotta memorize it, you gotta put it like in blank form kind of thing. I think if you just explain it in a more, the way you explain it, I think it will be so much more fascinating for kids to learn also.
Yeah, that's true.
And also make it sort of relatable to them. I think for me, I had a big problem in history lesson because I cannot relate at all. Like, I just can't relate at all. So yeah, just phrasing of how you see things, I guess.
I feel like when we grow up also, then our interest to history actually starts to pick up. Like once you get more
Curious about your roots.
About roots. Then when stuff like politics start to actually affect you. I mean, that's when you once you start working and all that. And then that's when you start to be curious about like the history, like oh, why is like Singapore this way? Why is our culture this way? The government is this way. And then that's where you start to get curious. And then that's where I think what you post actually becomes very helpful because then we have a source to kind of get information from. Because I think in your TikTok channel, those videos that you post, like it's hard to find.
So where do you find these actually?
They're actually mostly on YouTube.
Oh, wow.
It's just that you need to know the correct keywords.
Okay.
That's where you
Fair
Because,
enough.
because you won't find them if you search Singapore history, for example.
Is it?
You will need to search like the specific event, the specific person's name.
Okay.
And there are few channels that have these own videos that you can find, and that's where you really enjoy it. It's not some secret archive that
Yeah.
I'm getting them from.
I mean, the interviews with Lee Kuan Yew are captivating. You know, it really keeps the person there looking at the video.
Yeah, actually, the interview of Lee Kuan Yew was actually from US television from 1967. So it's nearly an hour long, and he actually gives many important points about the ongoing war in Vietnam, decolonization in Southeast Asia, uh, what uh, what the region was expecting from America,
Right.
what were they worried about regarding China, and these are things that. It's interesting to see a snapshot of how global events were in 1967.
Absolutely.
And Lee Kuan Yew's view of it. I mean, think about it. In 1967, Lee Kuan Yew was just, a prime minister of a country that's been independent for just 2 years. And yet,
Oh,
here
yeah, wow.
acclaimed American journalist asking this prime minister, what are your views about American policy, about Southeast Asia's policy, future, things like that. So it is a significant piece of history.
Yeah. It's so interesting to watch. I don't know if you all have seen it.
No, I sorry.
I mean, I would think most Singaporeans have at least seen these clips of him telling off the journalist,
Here and there, like
to
bite-sized
back off,
pieces. But I don't think many of us actually sit through the hour-long interviews unless you're really into politics or really into like Lee Kuan Yew himself or want to learn his lessons. Like, do you watch the whole interview yourself, like 1 hour?
Not the whole 1 hour, but a
Snippets of it, right?
longer snippets, rather, of whatever I could have found in the past, at least. Yeah.
So anyway, Dev, so like I think Ami just now said you have your own TikTok channel. You also like release your content in many other platforms. Like you have your own blog, you have your own Twitter, your own newsletter, and just recently of last year you have your own podcast now, right? So actually, just like what do you plan to achieve with all this content? What do you want to teach the people?
Well, I guess the mission is quite simple. It's to just make history more accessible to the public. Because all these sources, whether they are videos or newspaper articles or pictures, photographs, they are actually on archives websites and other databases. But people generally don't go looking for them.
Exactly,
So they
that's
need
true.
to be brought out into the mainstream. So I guess my mission is mainstreaming history.
Digitizing it in a way.
It's already digitized. It's more about just
Oh, wow.
putting it on.
Okay, shows how much we know.
It's more like just putting it onto popular social media platforms.
Basically, you do all the hard work. You dig into everything and you compile it into a bite-sized kind of a manner for normal consumers to.
Yeah, I guess something like that. Yeah. So I'm not creating like history or anything. Or I'm not a pioneer in like discovering something that was previously completely unheard of. Some people have heard of it. Definitely those who are
Definitely.
in the history space have know about these sources. It's just I'm just bringing it more into the mainstream for those who otherwise would not encounter history in their daily lives.
Yeah.
So it's a real passion project of yours, I would
Yeah,
say.
it's just a passion project.
And why do you think learning about history is important?
Well, I think that there are many lessons to be learned from history, and some of the reasons for how Singapore is structured in a certain way, or why certain things are considered traditions or norms in Singapore have their beginnings in history. So, the reasons for certain policies, the reasons for certain decisions, why Singapore's trajectory changed in certain points of time in history. You need to learn the history in order to understand why certain things are the way they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this also applies to our colonial legacy as well. I mean, we had sometimes an overly rosy view of colonial Singapore
Yeah.
until quite recently. I
Mm.
think it was in conjunction with the bicentennial where a lot of important questions were raised about what were some of the ill effects of colonialism that have been underplayed or forgotten about.
Okay. And I'm actually very curious, like when it comes to history, how does one determine if that abstract is right, wrong, or like is it real or is it faked? I mean, what do people usually use to determine it?
Plus, it's like a saying, right? Like the winners write the history.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Sources all have bias. There's no such thing as a completely objective history.
Mm.
History. So some people think that okay, if it's a document in the archive, it has more legitimacy than perhaps oral
Correct.
history, which
Yeah.
is just someone's recollection of their memories and all. But that's not true because documents also carry the biases of the person who wrote it.
Exactly.
The colonial documents, for example, often have a very prejudiced remarks
Oh yeah.
about Asians, for example. So, and that's because it's written by a European colonial official, and to them, Asians are viewed in a certain way, less superior, perhaps, how do I say it?
Like because they're the ones colonizing us, they
Mm.
like they are the masters in a sense.
In a sense, superior to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a certain smearing attitude in the way that they write
Yeah.
about other. So these kind of attitudes and prejudices need to be taken into account when you are evaluating a source. Then another method that historians use is also to compare sources and get corroborations. You cannot just rely on a single source to say that okay, there's only one version of events. There's never one version of events.
Interesting. Yeah.
Why did it only happen to one person and there was literally no one else? It's all just based on the person's anecdotal, right? Anecdotal is
Yeah.
like kind of experience. So if there's one to dispute him, does that piece of information become fact?
I mean, it's rarely the case where a person has an experience that is that completely lacks any sort of interaction with someone else or with
Okay.
a particular event. But even if a person talks about okay, my experience, for example, my experience in living in a kampong, for example, and then you're the only person who's the survivor
Yeah.
who from the kampong.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so it means it's only your story, there's no one left in
Correct.
that household to corroborate.
Yeah, correct.
But you can look at the experiences of kampongs generally in Singapore
Oh,
from that time period, and then you
okay.
can compare and see what are some of the common themes that you can find in experiences. So that's how you try to kind of prove some of the elements of the story.
Oh,
You
okay.
still cannot just take it at face value.
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
It's like in China where I think what is it, the Mao Zedong era where they just had to burn all the books and then during that whole period where a lot of the archives are lost. And then the information that comes out of it, like history can just rewrite itself from there, right? Because they have destroyed all the archives and then they can just rewrite whatever new story they want to brainwash people.
I mean, there's also research that's being done in the case of the Cultural Revolution, where people researchers collect the diaries of people who lived during that era, and then kind of
Oh wow.
distill how people lived through that very tumultuous period.
Wow. So they would read everyone's diaries and sort of like just create a somewhat image of what it was like.
Or like challenge the facts that like the government has
Mm.
portrayed and stuff like that.
I mean, if you want to take a local example, like you can see it's like this so-called revisionist history, for example.
Revisionist history, what was that?
Yeah, I mean, in recent years, many of those former dissidents from the 60s and earlier have written their own memoirs and books about like my version of the history, of Singapore and such. So then that has led to a kind of contestation of who was the most accurate version of events.
Right.
Because for many years the standard Singapore story has been the memoirs of Lee Kuan Yew. Because for the first time he revealed many details about Singapore's history that he drew from the archives and his own records. And so around that same time, the UK started to declassify its archives that covered the period of Singapore's decolonization.
Okay.
And then many of these independent researchers and former dissidents kind of like looked through some of these documents to kind of prove their version of history. So
Wow.
then there's a kind of several versions of Singapore history that are in play. And some of these like non-establishment histories are often called revisionist histories
Okay.
because they're kind of like suggesting some sort of deviation from the established narrative. Yeah. But as Professor Tan Tayong has mentioned before, um, all history is revisionist history because history is constantly being reviewed as new sources come up, new perspectives come up, and then people kind of like revise and make additions to the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a new perspective
Yeah.
that can be discovered. So history is never static. There's no the
Yeah.
first historian who writes about this
Means he's right.
this,
No.
of this era or an event means okay that is a standard narrative and everyone else is revisionist. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's just that historians constantly revise, research
Hmm.
aspects of history.
Okay.
That's actually very interesting. So do you feel like in general does Singapore do a good job in preserving our history?
I guess thankfully Singapore doesn't have that long a history to go back to, so we only have to deal with like this like 50, 100 years.
Hey Ivan, when is Singapore independence?
Wait. 1965.
Don't look at me. I'm not looking at you guys. You guys are correct. I'm
I
just
have
thinking.
a question to you. Oh, no.
Okay, going back to Ani's
Why do
question.
you make me look stupid?
Bro, I asked you because I also don't know. I just don't want to hide as well answering. But going back to Ani's question, like, do you think Singapore is doing a good job in preserving Singapore's history?
I guess it depends on what kind of history.
Mm.
Maybe if you're an architectural historian, then much of Singapore's history has been
Yes.
lost.
Mm.
Because except for the records of building plans that we have at the archives, a lot of
The old buildings have been
historical
torn
buildings
down.
have been lost.
They're all gone, yeah.
Because there was a period in the 60s and 70s where the peasantry was really out with the old, in with the new.
Yeah.
So there was history was just seen as a kind of a burdensome thing that a new country
Mm.
could not afford because it had to focus on progress
Growth.
and future. So in terms of architecture, the city has been remodeled so much that many lovely heritage buildings have been lost.
Exactly.
So
Like,
that's an aspect that not very well preserved.
Yeah.
I mean, Singapore today and Singapore, 54 years ago is completely different. Like, it's a kampong place.
I mean there are some areas of like somewhat forced preservation,
like where?
but I don't feel that that's really enough.
Kampong Glam?
Like Juchet,
Juchet.
the buildings you're not allowed to really touch them.
Yeah, I think sometime in the 80s was when there was a realization that too much of the heritage is being lost.
Mm.
They kind of reverse course and they decided to preserve many of these heritage districts, especially the ethnic districts,
Yep.
Chinatown, Kampong Glam, Little India. So at least they still retain some flavor. But of course, how authentic it is
It's kind of-
people have different
yeah, it's questionable.
Do you speak a lot to people, like close to your peers or people around our age, maybe the early 20s, about Singapore's history? And do you feel that maybe the majority of Singaporeans, like the next generation, do they know a lot about Singapore's history?
Oh, it's an interest there.
Well, the interest is definitely there.
Okay,
Because
that's good.
from what I can see on my TikTok comments or on Twitter, is that they're very eager to learn
Mm.
and they're
That's good. Yeah.
they're kind of happy that there's this aspect of Singapore's history that's interesting
Mm.
that that they never came across because usually because it's not in the social studies textbooks.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when I try to share some of the interesting nuggets about Singapore history, they do respond quite well. They're like, oh, I didn't know that. Sometimes people who are not so young, they're probably older, they also kind of like recall fondly their childhood memories
Yeah.
when they see something.
A lot. I mean, a lot of it is that, right? That nostalgia aspect of culture.
Nostalgia is a very powerful feeling, and we saw in 2015 at the SG50
Yeah.
or that,
Oh,
and
yeah.
the bicentennial to a lesser extent, but still there. Yeah.
Actually, on this note, right, I went to do some research, and there was a study done back in 2014,
Mhm.
8 years ago, so not that recent, but basically it surveyed about 600 young Singaporeans. aged 17 to 25. And the question was very simple. The question was just asking them about their knowledge and perception about Singapore's history or Singapore's heritage. And the report showed that 85% of them, of these 600 people, are actually found it important to understand Singapore's heritage. But only 15% of them will seek out information about it. They know that it's important to learn about Singapore's heritage, but 15% of them only, actually actively source out information about it. And this is despite more than half of them saying that they felt that there were widely accessible materials on the topic. So,
Not prioritized, I guess, huh?
yeah, like why do you think there's such a big disconnect? Like, if there's information out there and most people, a big majority of them think that it's important to learn about Singapore's history, why don't more people do it? Why don't more people seek?
But I'm not sure if this is only something that's unique to Singapore because it's considered kind of like a good example of culture to profess an interest in history.
Okay.
Like I'm a man of culture.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's like the kind of like the accepted norm. That to be a person of culture, to be sophisticated, you need to know an appreciation of history, of art, and things like that. But most people probably will not expend the effort to go and find these things on their own. And that's the reason why I thought, why not make it more accessible to them on platforms that they would already use on a regular basis? I mean, no one, I hardly doubt that the average member of the public would go to the National Archives website and go and search the database.
Yeah.
Oh, there's an interesting picture here. Like, they would not do that. So, why not I do that and then put the picture on like Twitter?
Which is awesome.
And then they can they would come across that picture, higher likelihood of them coming across the picture. And then there's an awareness that the picture exists, and then you can learn a little bit about the history behind the picture.
Like personally, I feel right, like social studies, like in the textbooks, because they kind of teach us how to score, so it's a lot of memorization work. But honestly, I feel right, it's more important to focus on like the smaller things, the cultural aspect of our history, like the small things like the different racial groups, what do they wear, Peranakan culture, all this. I think it'll be more interesting when they actually cover that, and it's actually more relevant to us because we see our culture every day, like
It's interesting, more colorful, right?
more, yeah, and then okay, your mom, okay, she's Peranakan, okay, then you can form that relation, like, okay, then maybe her ancestors came from this, how they came to Singapore, then stuff like that they cover in the textbooks. I think it would be more interesting.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, one of the things that I also try to do is to look at the non-political history of Singapore.
Okay.
Because I think that because of the way social studies is taught, it's very linked to a political timeline. Before independence, merger, and then independence. And
Key moments.
Yeah, those key moments. So it's structured in that way. So this is kind of like a politics of great men.
Oh wow, well said. Yeah. Now that I think about it.
Yeah. So, but then there's also this movement in history called history from below. So the history of the average person, stories of
Interesting.
of people who were not in high positions but
The common folk.
yeah, common folk, and like their perspectives. Like what was the life of a hawker like?
Oh yeah, exactly. These are things
People love that.
more interested in.
Yeah.
I mean, even recently, there's a lot of TikTok videos like show me a time in 1991, and then he'll take clips of different videos from 1991.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah. So, and many of these videos were recorded by tourists.
Yeah.
And then you it's a perspective. It's interesting to see, how the Orchard Road look like.
Yeah,
man. Because that is a place that tourists will film their
the underground part with the aquarium. I don't know if you all can remember that. Yeah. There's links Taka to Somerset.
Really?
There was an aquarium.
The Wisma area.
The Wisma.
There was
There was aquarium.
Totally didn't know that.
in the 90s. There was an aquarium there.
Yeah. Looking back, when you post a lot of content on your Twitter and TikTok, what are some of the most viewed pieces of content? Maybe you can share. Like, is it fun facts about Singapore? Is it just an interesting piece that you want to share with the audience?
Well, I would say that videos of the economies seem to do very well. Although I try not to,
It's his charisma, man.
I try not to make it like a fan page of him. It's there are many other aspects of like Singapore history that I also want to focus on, but people do like to see any content that's related to Lee Kuan Yew. So his old speeches, some of the dialogue sessions that he used to have in the 90s and earlier. One video from the early 90s where he talked about the rise of religiosity in Singapore. And then that was quite illuminating because he actually warned about how such religiosity would lead in the future to tensions and a clash of cultures and things like that. So it was quite interesting to see what was he thinking about a future problem.
Yeah.
And it's quite amazing how accurate he was with a lot of his words.
It's very far-sighted. I mean, it's just vision and visionary.
Yeah.
That's 30 years ago.
But he was also inaccurate in some aspects.
Of course.
So, some of the views that he talked about probably might not be seen as
Controversial for sure.
Yeah. So, but it's important to know that these views existed at this point of time and that he expressed it in a certain way. So at least there's a record of that.
No, I'm curious, what kind of views he said that will be controversial?
Well, I mean, in the 80s, there was a whole graduate mother scheme that he was talking about, where he talked about those who are more educated women should have more children, and those who are less educated should have less children. So,
Okay.
Looks like very elitism.
yeah, so it rubbed people the wrong way even at that time. So that got controversial.
Highly controversial, that one.
I think it's important to remember that,
For sure.
that great figures, no matter how admirable, also have less admirable aspects.
Of course.
They are humans after all.
Absolutely.
They're not legends, you see. We see them as legends, but then they did not live as legends. They lived as humans.
Do you think there's not enough of that, like showing both sides? It's always like the good or just all the bad, and then people like sometimes it's like if there's something bad that's come out of history, we want to try and erase that.
Okay, this one is a bit.
Oh, then it's okay. We can.
Yeah, I think this one's a bit
Sensitive.
yeah, because you're going to explain it as you're going to it will cross some lines.
No worries. Then we'll just move on.
But I like what you said, like we see them as like legends, and the stories of them are legends, but they live their life as humans. Then they actually like kind of like makes them a lot more relatable to us. Because when we read about these figures, we always put them at like
A pedestal. I
A
cannot
real
relate
pedestal,
to them.
yeah.
I cannot relate to this stuff. That's why for me personally, I'll be more interested to know about the common folk. You know, what kind of life they lived at that time. You know, these kind of things that I'll be more related to.
I mean, you mentioned you asked earlier about what were some of the most popular content.
Yeah.
Other than videos of Lee Kuan Yew's speeches
Yeah.
and dialogues, pictures and snapshots of ordinary people also are popular. So one of the most viral images that I shared was this picture from the 1920s. Not there's no precise date, but from the 1920s.
such a long time back.
Of a Malay boy who is sitting on a crocodile.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it's just sitting on a crocodile, and he just went viral, even though he's not doing anything else, he's just sitting on a crocodile. But then people were sharing this, like it's just absurd to think of that a child will be allowed to sit on
Absolutely.
a crocodile.
Yeah. Like a photo of, like actual photo, like that's a snapshot of a kid actually sitting
Yeah.
Oh wow.
A large crocodile.
That's not a very wise idea though.
No, I mean in the past nobody really cared, about as much, I guess, about safety and all of that.
Like still instincts will kick in, like okay, that crocodile has sharp teeth, like
I mean, sometimes you got to realize how at that point in history the way of thinking was so different.
Yeah.
And sometimes we cannot process that difference in thinking, and then the absurdity of the
Yes.
situation becomes very strong.
oh, that's true. It's like imagine if like people in the year 2080, then they look at our YouTube channel of the guy who jumped into a cactus just for laughs.
But that's history.
Yeah, and this could be the same thing. It could be like a kid sitting on a
Yeah.
crocodile because it's like a
I mean, I was talking about this with you just now, right? Like, to us, history is like, especially based on how we learned, is World War One, World War Two, and all that. But to the future generations, history is Elon Musk fighting with uh, what's his name? The botak. Jeff Bezos for space travel. I mean, that's the future history that we're going to be talking about.
So the image was quite a hit. But recently I found that my excerpts of foreign letters through the ages have become quite popular.
Okay.
Yeah, so what I do is that I go and find interesting foreign letters from like the 60s or onwards, and then I post that on them. So some of them have very ridiculous views compared. I mean, now some of them were highly sexist.
Okay.
So
And you cannot imagine that you actually write it at that point of time.
yeah, it's quite interesting that these letters were considered acceptable.
Wow.
At that kind of time. So it's quite interesting to see these letters, and sometimes there's an argument between them. So one of the most interesting thing was examples is the one where uh, the someone wrote to the newspaper to complain about what I should say. No, because it includes NUS.
Oh.
Yeah, you can say that.
No, we can skip that as well.
Yeah.
Oh, but imagine next time in the future, people take our like Facebook comments, especially
I mean, they're already
on the
doing that, right?
history science page, and they put it in the history archive. Oh my god, it's going to be such a bad representation.
Technically, it's
of
already in the archive. Yeah.
People are looking at our current timeline, and oh my god, these people are idiots during this period.
I mean, future histories will be written based on collections of tweets, Facebook posts, or YouTube videos. I mean, now history of the 20th century is being written, looking at government documents, newspapers, and such. But histories of the 21st century will rely a lot on social media.
Yeah. And these kind of things are permanent, right? Once it's up there, it's up there.
Yeah.
But I guess it will be a lot more overwhelming for historians next time. Like now we have physical documents and objects that we can rely on, but it's not much.
But
Going through
the future historians currently are like trolls, right? They look through the history, find all the negative things you say, and then just piece it together.
Whatever suits their bias, right?
Yeah, I mean, what happened to another podcaster, Joe Rogan? They snipped since, and he's been doing it for what, 15 years. They snipped every time he said this negative word into one video. That means they had to watch 15 years worth of content. That's insane.
There's always someone who's willing to do that.
And there's always someone watching it.
That's true.
Yeah. You think who will be crazy to go and look through audio? There will be someone who will do it, and then they will make a post of
It's
it.
crazy.
And then the person will be screwed.
Actually, on this topic, right, do you spend a lot of your time just sifting through information? Like, what is an average? What do you do on a daily basis?
For me, well, I kind of set a goal on most days. I will try to make just one post on Twitter. So it could be a picture, it could be a newspaper article, it could be a video clip. So I try to find something. I don't spend too much time on it because it's just like a small little task that I clear every day. Yeah. So that's how I approach it. So I just check the databases, see what's interesting. If there's an important global development or certain local news story or kind of like a development that's going on, I see if there's any historical parallel that perhaps I can share.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're not like 24/7 full on like historian, just devour information.
But it's the career also.
No, I try not to spend that much time. Yeah. I mean, even on TikTok, most of the actual TikTok influencers post every day or multiple times a day.
Oh, yeah.
So I
Hours. They spend hours.
I post maybe twice a week at most. Yeah.
Just
Do
putting
you
stuff out there.
cover Singapore, or do you cover like Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia to a limited extent, but mostly Singapore, Malaysia. Because Malaysia's history is quite intertwined with ours, so it's very hard to separate the history of the two places. So usually I treat it as one separately. So I do have quite a lot of Malaysian followers who also appreciate the content, because
Nice.
especially parts of Singapore's history that have links to Malaysia, like the merger and all that.
Mm. How about Myanmar? Because I know a chunk of history from Singapore was intertwined with Myanmar quite a bit.
One of the most interesting things about the Singapore history in Myanmar that I found was this picture from I think in the early 50s. So Myanmar had donated several tons of rice to Malaya and Singapore
Okay.
because of floods here. So Myanmar gave us flood relief in the 50s.
Wow.
Because at one point they were like on the up and up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they were the prosperous country.
and we were
Oh.
somewhat learning from them, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not wrong. And then I spent some time there, and then the older generation has this hatred for Lee Kuan Yew because he said some very negative things about them back then. Yeah.
So I feel like the relationship between nations and culture through the ages is interesting. Like, we don't really see that. Like, I'm not exposed to it. I don't really come across it unless it's like brought up in social media.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the region because many history experts from the region produce very good content that perhaps we do not see because we often perceive the region as invisible to us because we often concentrate on Europe, on America,
Right.
on East Asia, Australia, New Zealand. We often are quite ignorant about our own neighborhood because perhaps it's in the mistaken thinking that it has nothing for us to learn from.
Interesting.
If you want to learn from the advanced countries, then why we want to learn about our supposedly less developed neighborhood? But there is a lot of history and there's a need to make connections with our
Correct.
neighbors.
Mm.
We need to be a bit more humble in learning from our neighbors as well.
Yeah, actually, on this point, do you worry about like the dilution in our history or culture? Like nowadays, everyone's getting more like they take a lot of influence from the Western media, and then because of that, maybe in the future, Asian culture will slowly kind of like get blended, and then you kind of lose like identity.
Well, I wouldn't say that this was a new phenomenon because in various aspects of our history, it's always been shaped by various cultures, whether East or West. And there was no time where Singapore had a pure Singaporean culture that was untouched and then is now in danger from another culture. So our own culture has always been a hybrid of
A melting pot.
I was about to ask, because you talk about Singapore identity, what exactly is Singapore's identity?
That's good.
Like
Metropolitan country.
So we just basically suck all the influence from other people and then we sort of adapt to it. Is it? Like we don't really have, or is that in itself our identity? Just the ability to.
Then is the losing of that history really like a thing, or is it meant to be? Is our identity a constant
Change.
change?
Evolution,
Yeah.
I mean, how our culture and identity has evolved through the decades itself is a record of history. So it's not necessarily mean that the history has changed because
Something happened.
because so many things have been happening and the culture has been evolving so much. The way the culture has evolved, the way things have changed, is itself historical.
I'm very intrigued. I'm very curious also. Like, for you, someone who has sifted through hours, perhaps thousands of hours of information and all these kind of stories, right? Is there any particular story or piece of history that has fascinated you? Like, it's just particularly memorable. I'm sure, there is one story that you read and then you came across it. You read it and wow, can't believe that this has happened before. Or you learned a big piece of knowledge from it. Well, I can see
Can
like
think.
sifting
I'm
through,
sure there's a
analyzing
lot.
what.
Yeah, this one must think.
Anything for it.
It doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be.
This is a big question.
Yeah.
Alternatively, is there a country's history that you are most fascinated in?
I guess in terms of Singapore's history, what I found something interesting was that because of all the recent publicity over the legal challenges to Section 377A,
Okay.
so like it's been going on for a few years. So I had a went and looked around the archives to see what was the debate around in the past. So it's quite interesting to trace how uh, 377A, for example, was discussed in the media
In the
as
past.
recently as 15, 20 years ago.
Okay.
And it was in the tone of letters, for example. It's quite interesting to see that. And it's also interesting to see the evolution of terms, for example. If you look in the early 60s, for example, the term gay meant happy.
Sorry, for
Yes.
those of people
Yes.
of our audience who don't know what 377A is.
Yep.
Yeah. What is 377A?
You explain. You're the one explaining.
No, I want to ask you guys. What is the definition of 377A? Is it just
It's a law that
illegal to get married?
criminalizes male relationships or sex.
Male
if
to
I'm not
male
wrong.
relationships,
Yeah.
same-sex relationships.
For men only, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Okay, so particularly only men. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So in the 50s and 60s, the term gay meant happy.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's very interesting to see old headlines where when we say like Singapore goes gay for National Day.
Oh my God.
I mean, Flintstones theme song, "Gay Old Time" is.
No,
is
but
in the
I mean,
song also.
A headline like that should be
Don't-
framed.
Yeah. So the city is gay today.
Wow.
Or even religious festivals, things like so and so was gay for this particular religious festival.
Ooh.
So the way that the term was used at that time period was quite interesting. And then you see from the 80s onwards, when the AIDS crisis started to appear,
Yeah.
and then you see how things have changed, and then the way the issues were talked about also evolved, and then in the 90s also started to change. And then when it comes to the 2000s and 2010, you can see how the terms change. So, like for example, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, the word homosexual was often used in media when discussing this issue. But from after 2010, there was a movement towards using the word, like the term LGBT, for example.
Yeah.
And that's the term that's often used now. So you can see through the media records how the attitude of most people towards a certain issue, a controversial issue that 377 has evolved.
Very interesting.
Very
interesting.
So that was something that struck me. So
I would love to see that in a TikTok video. Just kidding.
I actually have one TikTok video that's basically a compilation of all the historical headlines where gay men happy.
Oh,
Cool,
So
cool,
it's quite
cool.
interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
We should be sharing that. Okay. That's I really want to thank you for coming onto our show and sharing with us. You shared quite a lot. It's almost been an hour.
Probably before we end off, is there anything that you like to tell the youth today about Singapore history? Like, it's good to go and learn about Singapore history.
I would just say that history is not static. It's not gathering dust somewhere. It's lived experiences, often experiences that still touch our lives today, and it's definitely worth learning our history and seeing the parts that could have been taken, the parts that were taken, and some of the perspectives of people who made it in history and the people who did not make it in history. So I think all of these are very useful in understanding Singapore as a country, as a society, as a culture.
Oh, very well said.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think on behalf of the majority of the population, I'd like to thank you for spending all this time to compile all this information into a more accessible manner, because without people like you, I will never go into Singapore history,
Yeah,
to be honest.
we're all idiots in this room, and you're the smartest person here.
Yeah. I feel like I sound so ignorant. And this question has been bugging me. So, when Singapore's independence?
1965.
I'm right.
9th of August 1965.
See, you were right. You have confidence, man. I told you
this,
you're right.
Ivan, you should know it.
I don't know. It's like, at the moment, Joel caught me like and made me down myself.
All right. So thank you for coming on there. Where can the audience reach you? Is there a website, Twitter profile?
You can just find me on Twitter at Historyogi.
Historyogi.
Yeah,
Okay.
and also I'm also Historyogi on TikTok.
Nice.
Do you do yogi?
Sorry?
Do you do yogi?
No, it's just a combination.
Okay, we can add on.
All right.
All right, thank